everybody. It's nice to see everybody here tonight. My name is Mary O'Connell. I'm the president of the Old Bridgewater Historical Society, and I'm happy to see all of you. And tonight we have Don Wilding with us, but before I introduce him, I'd like to tell you about a few of the programs that we have coming up a little bit later in the fall. Our October program is in Massachusetts on the home front, and it's by James Parr, and that will be October 24th at 7 p.m. Then in November, we're going to be hosting Christopher Daly, and he will be speaking about the Sacco and Vanzetti case, which does have local interest. And that's on November 7th, again at 7 p.m., and those programs are right here in our memorial building. On Sunday, some of the board members will be at the Common in East Bridgewater for the East Bridgewater Business Association Fun Fair. Is that what it's called? Family Fun Fair. So if you're around in East Bridgewater on Sunday, stop by our table and say hello. We'll be there from 10 until 2. We are back to our regular hours here at the Memorial Building, 12 to 3 on Wednesdays. During the summer, we did it a little bit earlier because the building heats up to the point where it's terribly uncomfortable in the afternoon. So now we're back to our regular schedule. So tonight we have Don Wilding, and he has a very extensive biography, but I'm just going to mention a few of his wonderful background accomplishments. So since the start of the millennium, he has been telling stories of Cape Cod beach history through lectures, video, and the written word. Don is the author of 5 books on Cape Cod history. Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898, and that was published in May of 2023. Hi, come on in. His earlier books are Henry Beston's Cape Cod, How the Outermost House Inspired a National Seashore, A Brief History of Eastham on the Outer Beach of Cape Cod, and Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, Stories of Triumph and Tragedy. And his 5th book, which is over here, Historic Storms of Cape Cod, was released on May 20th of this year. Don has worked as a Cape tour guide and as a regular speaker on Cape Cod lore in Massachusetts and across New England. He was an award-winning newspaper editor, writer, and designer in Massachusetts for 36 years, including a recent stint as a continuing history columnist and photographer for Cape Cod newspapers. Don has also led history walks for the Harwich Conservation Trust since 2018 and was recognized as one of their Conservationists of the Year in 2023. So, Don.
Thank you, Mary.
Looking for your program.
Storms that did not miss Cape Cod, and for that matter, didn't miss us here either. Some of them I'll be talking about. Tonight it's Historic Storms of Cape Cod, and you don't have to go far to get to the Cape from here. And even when you're up this way, you will feel if the Cape is getting whacked, you might be feeling it here too. One thing to remember about storms, it's like a sporting event almost on Cape Cod when you get when the storms are really cranking. Everybody wants to get out there and see what's going on. And my friend Nan Turner Waldron, who wrote a book called Journey to Outermost House, she said, every one of us needs to feel beyond self, to feel small measured against distant horizons, to feel powerless against the winds, and to feel voiceless against the thunder of the storm. Cape Cod has a lot of special features which affect the damage that the storms can do there. The sustained high winds can push seawater far high above high tide levels, especially in the enclosed bays. Buzzards Bay collects high water and hurricane winds from the south. Cape Cod Bay fills up during nor'easters. And the shallows east and south of the Cape get very choppy in storms, just as the North Sea does. So keep all that in mind when it's going to come at you from all different directions. Hurricanes. The name hurricane actually comes from the Mayan god Huracan. And That's, according to legend, he sent his thunderbolts and ferocious windstorms upon the people and blew the seas into raging fury that swept all creatures before him into death and destruction. Cape mariners would later come face to face with hurricanes' towering anger and developed a healthy respect for it. You get two kinds of hurricanes that come up the coast usually and hit the eastern seaboard. They either develop off the coast of Africa near the Cape Verde Islands or in the Caribbean. The Cape Verde systems tend to be giant storms. This was told to me last year by Glenn Field, who was in charge of, he was the warning coordination meteorologist for the Boston area of the National Weather Service in Norton, just up 495. And he said that Cape Verde systems tend to be really giant storms. They take over a week just to get across the Atlantic. And the Bahamas storms, well, they tend to be smaller, but they accelerate up the coast and they give you very little lead time. Here's something to remember, a rule of thumb. A storm has to be 72 degrees west longitude when it's down off of in the Caribbean, off the southern United States, to have a chance at hitting us. 72 degrees west longitude. So if it's a little bit further out, it's probably going to miss us, like Hurricane Lee about a year ago this month was about 68 degrees, and that missed us by about 100, 200 miles to the east. So that's something to remember. If it's 72 degrees west when it's down there and they're raving about it on TV, well, pay attention. Definitely pay attention. Pay attention regardless. But the point when New England needs to take action is when there's a named storm in the Bahamas. If it's off the North Carolina coast, you're late. You're already having impacts from the storm. And then there's our old friends, the nor'easters, that whack us during the winter time, and during the fall and during the spring too. Cape Cod is right in the path of these powerful storms. They usually develop in the latitudes between Georgia and New Jersey within 100 miles east or west of the East Coast. The storms generally progress northeastward and typically attain maximum intensity near New England and the maritime provinces of Canada. And when it comes to nor'easters, there was probably none more deadly than this one, the Portland Gale of 1898. Even though it's called the Portland Gale, it's named the Portland Gale not because of what it did to the city of Portland, but what it did to the paddle steamer Portland, which unfortunately resulted in the death of almost 200 people. They refer to this as the Titanic of New England, because on November 26th and 27th, 1898, Thanksgiving weekend, that's what happened. It left Boston, never made it to Portland. It was described as being a night to try men's souls, a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. And it was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. Steamer Portland, heading to Portland from Boston over Thanksgiving weekend. Almost 200 people aboard, including crew, passengers, etc., also carrying freight. So this is one of the primary methods of transportation between Boston and Portland at that time. The only other competition really was the railroad. So they are trying to get all these people, this is Thanksgiving weekend, remember, Saturday night of Thanksgiving weekend. The steamer's ready to leave India Wharf in Boston at 7 p.m. It's filling up with people, even though there's a bad forecast. And they're cramming people in there wherever they can get them. And even though it had some very stately rooms and everything, very luxurious vessel, everybody knew about it, but it never made it to Portland. It was one of 141 vessels that were wrecked during that storm at sea. 40 of those boats were from Cape Cod. 456 lives were lost at sea. That includes the nearly 200 aboard the Portland. Left Boston at 7 p.m. By 7:37, it was snowing. And then the winds kicked in to near hurricane force winds. This was not expected to be as severe as it was. But you had one of those situations where one storm was coming in from the west, coming in from the Midwest area, another coming up the coast. They didn't foresee this coming. Then you had that bombogenesis effect that weathermen love to talk about. Boom, it just grew into this monster storm. The Portland got caught in it. People aboard other ships and from shore saw it going up along the North Shore without its lights on. Some say it lost its superstructure during the storm, but it kept going up and then it started to drift out to sea, and then nobody really knows what happened. This is really just a guess. But by 3 a.m., it's out over Massachusetts Bay. It was believed at first to have wrecked off of Cape Cod, but it ended up going down over Stellwagen Bank in Massachusetts Bay. The remains of it are now in 460 feet of water. The keeper at Highland Light in Truro recorded a wind gust of 90 miles an hour during the storm. There were other observations of over 100. In Hull, the keeper of the life-saving service station there, Joshua James, estimated visibility was about 100 yards at best at sea. So if you're out at sea and you can't see anything beyond 100 yards, you're in big trouble. You're in very big trouble. And that's ingredients for collision. Some people said the Portland may have collided with another vessel. A lot of people don't think that was the case, though. Within 2 hours, nearly 200 vessels from Casco Bay, Maine to Martha's Vineyard were scrambling for some safe harbor from the storm. Up in Provincetown, the U.S. Life Saving Service was busy. Well, they were busy all over the Cape, but particularly, this is the people that eventually became the U.S. Coast Guard. And the surfmen from the Life Saving Service in Provincetown worked like fiends. Now, they were out there patrolling beaches looking for bodies. They found 37 bodies on the beaches of Cape Cod. No other place had any bodies wash ashore. It was just Cape Cod from Provincetown down to Monomoy is where they found bodies. And most of the bodies that came ashore were down near Chatham, Orleans area, as opposed to up around Provincetown. But the surfmen were out on the beaches and the sand cut their faces until they were raw and bleeding. That's what that sand can do when it's blowing. I mean, it might, if you were just walking on a summer day and it's windy and that sand's hitting you in the leg, you're like, wow, that's annoying. Now imagine if it's 90 miles an hour and blowing right in your face. It's like a dagger, it's like a whip hitting you in the face. It can just cut you right open. There were also a lot of light ships stationed off of Cape Cod at that time. These were basically ships that were lighthouses, floating lighthouses. One of them was called the Pollock Rip Lightship. I'll be talking about a few other lightships and for some of the other storms, but Pollock Rip Lightship off of Chatham was ripped from its anchors during the storm and drifted all the way down south, not just to New York or New Jersey, but to Delaware. That's where it finally ended up before they could tow it back to Massachusetts. The harbors at Provincetown and Vineyard Haven, and this is what they looked like. This is Provincetown, the waterfront. All the wharfs were destroyed in Provincetown. 5 feet of water in Commercial Street in Provincetown. And all the wharfs being destroyed. 36 schooners out in Provincetown Harbor were being thrown around, tossed around like toys. Several men died aboard these ships. Also in Vineyard Haven, about 50 schooners were tossed around like toys, according to the newspapers. And one of the things I found out about this, there were 2 ships that were carrying lime during this storm. Now, one thing I didn't know about lime until I started researching this, if it gets wet, it ignites, catches fire. And that's what happened to 2 of the ships. They caught fire as they were being thrown around during this storm with all these other ships in Vineyard Haven Harbor. And the men aboard one of them were faced with the ordeal, oh my God, what do we do? Do we burn or do we drown? And fortunately, they got close enough as they were being thrown around, close enough to another ship that wasn't on fire, jumped off, and they were able to save themselves. The other one sat there in the harbor after the storm, still on fire until December 19th. About 4 weeks So that gives you an idea of how hot things got. Also, the railroad tracks in Sandwich, West Barnstable, and North Truro washed out, delayed train travels for several days. Trees were down Cape-wide. This was a common occurrence during all these storms, because when you get the big storms down there and the wind flies, the trees just come right down on the Cape. Both are in Sandwich. This is the railroad right along the Bayside where they had an incredible storm surge. And this is downtown Sandwich where a lot of big trees came down. So jumping ahead now, almost 40 years, the first of the great hurricanes of the 20th century. Now, there were some other ones before this, but this one was the one that woke everybody up, kind of. That's if it didn't kill anybody. Over 600 people died in New England during the 1938 hurricane, also known as the Long Island Express or the Great New England Hurricane. This is the track it took, moving up very quickly out of the Caribbean, off the ocean, off through past Florida, up the coast, slammed into Long Island. It made landfall over Long Island and then again over Connecticut. I believe it was Milford, Connecticut. And the Blue Hill Observatory recorded sustained winds at 121 miles an hour, 186 mile an hour gusts. Storm surges, this was the big problem on the Cape, especially the storm surge, 18 to 25 feet in Buzzards Bay. So the water just came up in there and there was nowhere for it to go. 20 feet of water in downtown Providence, 8 feet of water in the streets of Falmouth. This is one of the scenes from Falmouth, and there were also similar scenes to this in Wareham. A Wareham newspaper editor described this. He said, "Then came the dawn. Words cannot describe it. To the writer whose own newspaper plant had been under 6 feet of water, the thought came to him, as it must have to all who sustained like losses, that the blow was too great to realize. Where to begin? What to do? Nobody knew, but everybody began to do something, futile as it might seem." A couple of stories out of Falmouth. There was a woman and her nephew who went out just before the storm. Nobody knew this storm was coming. This was way before forecasting got to the level that it needed to be. And these two were out. The woman ended up drowning because they were out doing errands around Falmouth, and then they went and did some shopping. And as they're going home, the storm gets much, much worse, and they don't understand why. And the gas gauge on their car is getting low. And the nephew points out to his aunt, "Hey, we should get gas." She's like, "No, we'll go. Let's just get home." So they're going across an area near the Moore Pavilion, Beach Road, right next to where the water's coming in, off of this storm surge that's coming in off of Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound. And they're both in the car, and the car runs out of gas. They're right on the road by the water. So the nephew says, "I'm going to go get gas. You want to come with me?" She says, "No, I'm going to stay here with the car, and I'll watch the storm." And so she's in the car. He goes to get gas. He comes back. She's gone. She's not there anymore. And he found out later from some eyewitnesses that she tried to get out, and she kind of faded into the very low visibility there during the storm, and they found her body the next day. And she was, just trying to get out of the situation, and she couldn't make it. A couple of people tried to rescue her too, to no avail. There was also a couple in the Silver Beach area who had fled to the roof of their house because water was coming into their yard, rushing into their yard. They ran into their house, first floor. Water came in there. Up to the second floor, water came in there. They climbed out onto the roof. The water got so high, tore the roof off of the house, sending them on a wild ride on their rooftop all the way across town, practically across town, until it crashed into another house, killed them both instantly. Then in Bourne, there were 5 residents of a cottage in the Gray Gables area who died when the structure dropped into Buzzards Bay and was swept into the Cape Cod Canal, came to rest against the north side of the Bourne Bridge. The victims ended up being removed from a hole in the cottage's roof. So these were some of the other scenes from around Buzzards Bay. This is the Buzzards Bay train station under several feet of water. You can see the railroad bridge in the background. And another scene here from Falmouth, a lot of destruction on the waterfront. And it was pointed out that the water rose here because it was caught in a bottleneck. We had no place to go. The tide was rising also just as the wind was rising. So you had all these perfect ingredients for all kinds of destruction to happen. So they were a little bit better prepared when September 14th, 1944 rolled around. They started to perfect the forecasting and warning systems for something like this. And the big difference was on the Upper Cape area, there were about 17 people who died. And of course, 600 around New England. But following this storm, way fewer fatalities. The Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944, this was another Category 3, but this one arrived 3 hours after high tide. So that alone was better, but the Mid and Lower Cape actually sustained more damage than the Upper Cape area. And you can see the path this one took, kind of came a little bit just west of the Cape Cod Canal is where it tracked. The big area for casualties was actually at sea, and Vineyard Lightship number 73. It was at its usual station near Cutty Hunk Island in Vineyard Sound. And it went to the bottom during this storm. 12 men perished. They were under orders to remain at their station. They had to ride out the storm. And during the early morning hours of the 15th, as the region is being battered by winds of 105 miles an hour and a storm surge of 8 to 10 feet, people could see flares out in the vicinity of the lightship's location. Those flares didn't last long. That's because the ship went down during the night. The lightship's bell is now on display at the New Bedford waterfront. West Dennis took it really hard. They were hit very hard. Lower County Road in West Dennis was under 8 feet of water. The Lighthouse Inn at West Dennis Beach suffered its worst damage ever. They had a new dining room that was built just 3 months before, in June that year. And it was completely destroyed, just swept away by the incoming waves and washed into Weir Creek on the other side of the road. 27 cottages east of the inn, they were also destroyed. This is in Chatham. Boats were swept from the Stage Harbor shore, piled up on Turns Island. There were several buildings and wharves that were destroyed. Winds blew the steeple off the Chatham Universalist Church, and the Morris Island Bridge, shown here, was washed out as well. And German POWs from Camp Edwards were enlisted to help with the cleanup of downed trees all over the Cape. And 4 sawmills ended up being brought in by the U.S. Army just to turn the trees into lumber. They got quite a bunch of lumber out of all of this. So 10 years later, there's, excuse me 1 second. 10 years later, 1954, we had not 1, 2 hurricanes, back to back, twin hurricanes, Carol and Edna. The last century, 20th century, had 4 significant hurricanes all come within a 16-year period. Carol and Edna came within 12 days of each other. First was on August 31st of 1954 was Carol. Took a very similar route to the 1938 hurricane. And then Edna actually cut right across Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. Carol was a Category 3 storm. Storm surge coincided with high tide as it moved northward with a forward speed of 40 miles an hour. Yeah?
Can you tell me why they all of a sudden started actually giving names to the storm?
I was going to get to that, actually.
Okay.
afterwards. Yeah, this was, it was going forward at 40 miles an hour. The storm surge was 14 feet, sustained winds at 80 to 100 miles an hour. High tide was 10.5 and 11 feet above mean high water on the Falmouth shore of Buzzards Bay. Actually, I'll answer that question right now. Prior to 1950, they were just calling them whatever they could, fancy name they could come up with. Great Atlantic Hurricane, Long Island Express, whatever, of 1938. They started in 1950, between 1950 and 1952, they were using a phonetic alphabet to name them. So they would go with, there was actually in 1950, there was Hurricane Dog, you know, for the D, Hurricane D as in dog, that's what they had. Hurricane Dog went right to the east of Cape Cod, did a lot of damage, actually. And then in 1953 is when they started using women's names, female names for the storms. There was actually a Hurricane Carol in 1953 also. This one in 54 forced them to retire the name. Then in 1979 is when they started adding male names to it as well. And so they've been doing it that way ever since. That's how the whole name thing came about. During Carol, the beginning of Carol, when things were starting to happen down in the Falmouth area, there was a fellow named John McLaughlin who got a phone call from his neighbor, Martha Winnick, asking if his daughter Jean was available to babysit. She said it was an important engagement. And McLaughlin was a little more worried about all these high waves that were coming off of Vineyard Sound. And he said to her, get out of the house, but it ended up being too late. 2 hours later, Martha Winnick and her sister and 3 daughters all perished when the storm surge of Carol swept over the road and carried the Walters house like a cork into Great Pond and smashed it into pieces. On the Outer Cape, things were not as extreme, but they were still pretty bad. Young Lydia Moore, who was all of 13, I talked to Lydia maybe about 7 years ago. It was a story I did for the Cape Codder. And she was telling me all about how her family and her aunt, 2 cousins, and 2 friends went to this camping trip out on Sampson Island in Pleasant Bay during that weekend. They ended up riding out the storm before they had to be rescued by the Coast Guard. She actually asked her father, said, can we still go? And he said, yeah, sure. And they went out there, and it's raining like crazy, the wind's blowing like crazy, and they're in a tent, they're getting soaked. They had a dog with them and all kinds of goodies to eat, and they were thrilled. They were having a grand old time. Well, as they're having a grand old time, people on land are starting to get a little worried. That knew they were out there, they ended up sending the Coast Guard duck boat to rescue them. And they came back, and Lydia said, I can only imagine what these other parents were thinking, you know, when we went out there. But, you know, she said it was a great time, even though it was a deadly hurricane to a lot of New England. 2 weeks later, not even 2 weeks later, comes Hurricane Edna on September 11th. 2 storm surges, first on the Nantucket Sound beaches, and then again on the Cape Cod beaches, Cape Cod Bay beaches. Ended up being a huge storm surge in Wellfleet Harbor. So, you know, you get a double, kind of a double shot with that storm as well. During Hurricane Edna, another lightship, the Nantucket lightship, was in big trouble. They endured 2 hours of hell during this hurricane, but yet somehow managed to survive. It was described as a 959-ton floating lighthouse, her bow plates smashed, rudder gone, and her bridge almost demolished, groped into port under tow. And aboard was the 12-man crew who couldn't have abandoned ship even if they wanted to. That's how bad things got. But yes, somehow they managed to hang on and survive. They don't know how they lived through it. So now, we'll jump into probably one of the more famous nor'easters that you all might have really fond memories of. The storm known as the Blizzard of '78. And up here you remember 3-4 feet of snow, lots of high snow drifts, school being canceled for at least a week, and state of emergency, cars buried on 128, et cetera, et cetera. On the Cape, it was more of a, not a snow event so much, it was a tidal event. The very high tides that happened during this storm. The forecast was pretty much for a normal to strong nor'easter, 8 to 16 inches of snow, 25 to 40 mile an hour winds. Well, there was a high tide during the new moon. So you have this astronomically high tide. 14.5 feet above mean low water, 4 feet above normal. So you got that. On top of that, you've got a storm surge and these winds that were hurricane force, 92 miles an hour officially. Somebody at Chatham's weather station clocked it at 120 before it gave out. The Coast Guard beach bathhouse in Eastham and the parking lot were completely destroyed. A 50-foot long concrete septic tank was unearthed near the bathhouse there. This was the scene at Coast Guard Beach, looking south over that barrier beach there from the Coast Guard station. Looking down, that entire beach was washed over during this storm. This is a scene from the air. One of the beach camps there, the Butterfly House it was called, waves circling it. This had been on the beach there for many years. That was what it looked like after the waves had gotten it. And of course, Henry Beston's famous Outermost House was also a casualty to this storm. Beston wrote his book, The Outermost House, back in 1928. And it survived many storms, but it would not survive this one. Beston was no longer alive when this happened, but a lot of people mourned its demise because it was such a symbolic structure for Cape Cod. And that too, it ended up, this was before the storm in the dune, and after the storm, just the 4 posts, and it was on a sandbar. That's what it looked like. That's how much damage was done, how destructive it was. They found some parts of it ashore off of Nauset Marsh, but this was again, a very symbolic house. That's a whole nother talk that I do. But observing this storm was actually pretty easy because the second day of the storm, there was an eye had developed. So it was like a hurricane. The eye came up right across Cape Cod. So while the eye is passing over the outer Cape, Boston and the South Shore area here are still getting slammed with snow. And the sun came out, temperatures are in the 40s out there, the wind had died down, everybody came out to Coast Guard Beach. You could see all these people, like thousands of people came out to watch the show that the ocean was putting on. And the bathhouse there was getting destroyed by these waves. And that's what the bathhouse looked like before the storm. And the Cape Cod writer Robert Finch, he writes essays in Nature and things like that. And Finch told me about 10 years ago, he said, there were hundreds of people there watching the waves smash up against the bathhouse. And he said, with every wave, the crowds would just cheer. He was just making this, he smiled as he said that. And then he said, and then I said, why is that? What are we cheering about? You know, of course he knew why. But, you know, he says, that stuck in my mind about that whole incident there. During the storm also, the first night of the storm, before Coast Guard Beach, I don't know if you've been there recently, there's not a lot left in front of the Coast Guard station now. Back in 1978, before the storm, there was a huge parking lot, bathhouse, and amphitheater in front of that Coast Guard station. There was quite a lot of in front there, and big parking lot. So during the storm, this Volkswagen Beetle filled with 4 high school teenagers goes driving down in the dark to watch the storm. And they're thinking, wow, this is going to be cool. We're going to watch the storm. And so they're driving into the parking lot, and what they don't know is happening. As they're driving in, the waves begin breaking in behind them. So they don't know it yet, but next thing they know, a big wave comes in underneath the Volkswagen, lifts it up, carries it into Nauset Marsh, right in back of the beach, and they're terrified. Their lights go out. They're floating around, being thrown around, oh my God, we're gonna die, thinking. And then they look up at the Coast Guard station and they see some lights on. And that clicked just enough so that they could get out of the car, get their way through the water, climb the hill, and get up to safety. They said otherwise, if they didn't see those lights, they probably would have perished. So it's a while before they can get to the car again. The car ends up being towed out of the marsh a couple of days later, brought to Orleans. They bring it into the station. The mechanic there starts working on it, changes some fluids, puts the key in the ignition, voila, it starts. Volkswagen should have been there to make a commercial. And it was just the most amazing thing, because other people in Eastham and Orleans were not so lucky, because they were in the area in South Eastham on Route 6 twice during high tides during the storm. Route 6 flooded from both sides, from the bay side down near Governor Prince Road, also from the Nauset Marsh area. So it's flooded on Route 6, and some people are trying to drive through it, and they're being told, no, don't do it. And some people did, and their cars, the engines couldn't take the salt water, and that was that. So this is pretty amazing that this car made it. Up in Provincetown, this is the scene behind the Lobster Pot restaurant out near the water, 5 feet of water, almost 5 feet of water in some parts of Commercial Street again. And this had the eye, so did the Portland Gale. Portland Gale also had an eye. So these two storms were eerily similar. And down around Monomoy Island, Monomoy was actually split into 3 pieces during this storm. And huge waves broke through the 30-foot dunes at Boston Beach and Truro. That was the first storm to flood the Pamet River, which comes in from the bayside. So that actually made the Outer Cape, at least Truro and Provincetown, into an island very briefly, as was Eastham during high tide during that storm. So that legendary storm was out of the way, but in 1987, to start off the new year, January 2nd, there was a winter storm that triggered 68-mile-an-hour winds in Chatham, but more importantly, it punched the hole through Chatham Bar. And Chatham Bar was never, and Chatham Harbor were never the same after that. This storm, the high winds and the high water that happened, mostly the water height, was because of a factor called syzygy. Syzygy, S-Y-Z-G-Y, pronounced syzygy. This term describes a celestial lineup of Earth, Moon, and Sun when the Moon aligns directly opposite the Earth and Sun, or between the two bodies, and the alignment bulges the tide in some areas of the Earth. So that's what happened here. Also, a lot of other things were at work during this storm, but there'd been a long cycle of changes in that beach as well over 150 years. The January 2nd storm cut a 200-yard swath through North Beach directly across from the Chatham Coast Guard station. By mid-month, that was up to 405 feet. By the beginning of February, 1,600 feet. Erosion had occurred along the northern tip of the newly created South Beach, and North Beach also extended somewhat further south, though it was a new alignment of the sandbar there, the barrier beach. So this gives you an idea of what it looked like before the storm. That's Chatham Bar. This is a satellite photo. And see, it's solid, but here you got the break. This is in 1987. So you got North Beach and South Beach now. This has since changed quite a bit. I think this one is closed up, but then there's been other ones that have formed in other different places at different times after different storms. So it's kind of tough to keep up with it. This whole thing, Dr. Graham Geis from the Center for Coastal Studies explained this 150-year cycle, how things shifted along. That's the details are in the book, but he went on and explained that whole thing to me, which I found kind of fascinating. Jump ahead now to 1991, and we had two more big storms that year. First, Hurricane Bob. I'm sure many of you might remember that pretty well. August 19th, 1991, the peak winds on the gusts, for gusts anyway, on the Cape, and Brewster and North Truro, 125 miles an hour. Highest sustained winds were in North Truro, 100 miles an hour. Storm surges of 12 to 15 feet along Buzzards Bay. This was the scene at the Sandcastle Resort in Provincetown. This is right off of Route 6A as you're going from Truro into Provincetown on the bay side. And this place was, it looks like it was an old hotel that was turned into a timeshare type of resort, but they lost their roof during Hurricane Bob. And that's the roof all over, shattered all over the ground there. There's a lot of stories in the book about women that were, one family of women were hiding in the bathroom just to, in the closet or whatever, just trying to stay safe from it. And when I went to get these photographs last year from the Sandcastle Resort, the woman who's the general manager there got me these photos, and then she said, she was telling me, I was living on Commercial Street in Provincetown during Hurricane Bob. And she said, I went outside, and it wasn't really raining much at all, but the winds were just crazy out there. But she said, I'm having a great time just walking around outside, watching all this wind, and there are people out there in the streets, they're having hurricane parties. They're having a ball. And she said, and then I turned around and looked up and I saw a roof fly by. I got back inside real quick after that. But there were several hotels that actually lost their lids during Hurricane Bob. This was the scene in Orleans. The windmill there lost a couple of its blades. And this was the scene over on Namscayket Road. The Oddfellows Hall lost some siding as well. So a couple of months later, while a lot of the Cape is still recovering from Hurricane Bob, they get whacked with another storm that meteorologists had a tough time explaining. It ended up being called, in the public's eye anyway, the perfect storm. Might have read the book or seen the movie. But it was also known as, first, the Halloween gale or the no-name storm. Because they were calling it that, they considered classifying, the National Hurricane Center considered classifying it as a hurricane. But the other branches of NOAA decided against this to avoid unnecessarily confusing and alarming the public. So they ended up just calling it the Halloween gale or the no-name storm. And then the movie and the book took over, and now it's known as the perfect storm. There were several weather factors that played into this. There was a hurricane named Grace that was dying out from the south. And then coming in from the west was a cold front that was colliding with a strong developing low pressure area off of Canada. So you had these three things come together very quickly. And then what it did was it developed off of the Canadian Maritimes, and then it just kind of drifted out here, swung back underneath to the south of Cape Cod, looped around, and then back up into the Canadian Maritimes. That took 5 days. And nobody could really explain why it was doing that, but it was, the effects of it were felt from Canada all the way to Puerto Rico. But the worst of it was felt right along the Massachusetts coast. You probably saw what happened to it if you saw the movie The Perfect Storm, what happened along the North Shore and offshore. But what happened on Cape Cod, there was plenty of things involved as well, plenty of destruction there as well. The Perfect Storm, the name came from a conversation between the Perfect Storm author, Sebastian Younger, he summers in Truro, by the way, and the National Weather Service forecaster, Robert Case. They came up with that name. Cape Cod had wind gusts of 78 miles an hour at Morris Island and 79 in Provincetown. And a weather buoy off of Nova Scotia recorded a wave exceeding 100 feet. 100 feet. Now that's where they got the idea in the movie for when, you see, remember at the end when George Clooney's driving the boat and trying to get it up over that wave, that giant wave that's coming at him. That's where they probably got that idea, because nobody knows exactly what happened there. But with 100-foot waves off of the coast, and then east of the Cape, there were wave heights at 39 feet. So these waves are slamming into Cape Cod, especially down around Chatham, where at one of the beach camp villages at North Beach in Chatham, Bruce and Donna Edson had a beach camp there, and they'd been through their share of storms. And something wasn't quite right, though, leading up to Halloween in 1991. They were marooned. They ended up being marooned because they couldn't get a boat out there, couldn't get a helicopter or any kind of aircraft. So what ends up happening was several neighbors and friends staged this heroic rescue by ORV. And the rescuer described the whole thing as: the ride off the beach was pedal to the metal, your foot's stuck right to the floor, the transmissions are heating up, the sand is nothing but soup and you're sinking in. So if you stop, you're going to get stuck. The adrenaline is pumping. Fortunately, they made it. This picture up here, by the way, is me on the right-hand side. This was in 2005. This was the roof of Henry McCusker's boathouse right along Nauset Marsh. Had been washed away during the perfect storm. That roof was still there in 2005. My friend John March and I found it. I went looking for it again last year. It wasn't there, it was gone. Several other places, though, got hit hard. Nauset Light Beach lost 10 feet of cliff, and it washed the stairs away. That became a regular occurrence there. And in Truro, the Pamet River at Boston Beach saw an 82-foot cut created by the high surf. And at Grays Beach in Yarmouthport, the 1,000-foot boardwalk that was there got washed away. And out on the dunes of Provincetown, a lot of the dune shacks saw a lot of damage. Mildred Champlin, who's been out there her family's been out there for years. And in fact, she still goes out there occasionally, and she's in her 90s now. But she told me that Friday, November 1st, 1991, a week after they had left the Cape, they left right before the storm. They lived out of state. And they returned to check on the damage inflicted by the worst storm we had ever endured. And she went through the blizzard of 78 there as well. They came back to a lot of destruction after that. The house had gone through 5 days of that enormous storm, 10 high moon tides, and going out to the dune's edge, we were stunned to be looking down rather than out over the 100 feet of grass we had just a week ago. And the storm had clawed away maybe 75 feet of our frontage. The ocean was lapping almost at our feet. The dune to the east was demolished, and a waste pipe that had been under the sand was exposed, and it was easier to duck under it than it was to climb over it. So I focused on those storms mostly, but I also had some notables and near misses. The ones in the 20th century, the Marconi storm of 1901. This is when Guglielmo Marconi, the father of wireless radio, as they call him, had built his first set of towers out on Wellfleet, out on the cliffs in Wellfleet. And all the locals said, those aren't going to last, they're going to blow over. Sure enough, big nor'easter hits, it's gone. 1903, he rebuilds them and is able to do his transmission to England. There was also the Great Gale of 1917 and a hurricane of 1924. And then, as I mentioned before, Hurricane Dog in 1950. Hurricane Donna actually whacked the Cape pretty well too, especially West Dennis Beach was hit very hard. Nor'easters in January of '66 and December of 1990. During December of '90, there was ended up uncovering a lot of old archaeological things from under the sand from way back, the Native American settlements. that were there, and they had to work very quickly to salvage those because they would have just gotten buried again. 1992, another nor'easter, the tides were so high and messed up things at sea so badly that a bunch of pilot whales swam up Pamet River into Truro. They were up near the post office in Truro. That's how far upstream they swam. Many of them died. Some of them were rescued, though. Also, down in Orleans, right off the Rotary there, at the Stop and Shop, there was an announcement as people were shopping during the storm. Attention shoppers, it is now high tide in the parking lot, because the tide had been, it's right near an area that used to be known as Jeremiah's Gutter. There was an actual canal that ran from the bay to the ocean in that part of the Cape. And then, of course, there was Hurricane Edouard in 1996. Now, a lot of you might be saying, what was Hurricane Edouard? Well, it didn't do much. It was forecast to do a lot, though. There was a hurricane warning over Labor Day weekend of 1996. As my wife and I were out in Provincetown that weekend, and I think it was on Saturday, or either way, we decided to leave Saturday. I said, you know, there's a hurricane watch for the Cape, and they think it's going to be a warning, and they think this hurricane is really going to hit. So we should probably get out of here. We were living off Cape. So we got out in time. The next day, Sunday, the traffic was lined up. People trying to get off, because now it was a warning. People were lined up, not just from the bridge to Sandwich or Barnstable or Dennis or Harwich or Brewster, all the way back to the Orleans Eastham Rotary. 40 miles. People were sitting in traffic for 8 hours. Remember that the next time you're sitting by the second exit in Sandwich, swearing at the traffic. You know, that was, but that's why you see now all these signs along Route 6, you know, evacuation route. Thank Edward for that. There was also a lot of events in the 21st century, and some of the more notable ones were the blizzard of '05. There was 3 feet of snow on the Cape in January of 2005 during that storm. The entire winter, there was 8 feet of snow. I never saw anything like it. And another one I never saw anything like was the Stingjet storm of 2005, and that's what this graphic is here. It showed, this was a nor'easter that had hit New England, and it was pretty routine until it got out over Cape Cod Bay. And then it just tightened up, and it was so intense. It was, I think, 3 or 4 times stronger than a bombogenesis. Is how quick, it was hurricane force winds, especially along the mid and outer Cape that day, December 9th. And I was working out there at that time. And I came home in Dennis. We were going to have our holiday party in Chatham that night. And I never got to Chatham, because after I got back to Dennis, things were starting to brighten up, but then it got very dark. And the wind kicked up, and I never heard wind like that. It was just absolutely unbelievable. It was hurricane force. There were a lot of dolphins being beached along Cape Cod Bay at various places. Trees were down everywhere. You couldn't get out of Orleans because every road was blocked by a downed tree. It was just one of those events that, you know, if you weren't on the Cape, you probably didn't hear much about it, if at all. Also, some of the other ones, I'll just point out a couple of more here. In 2018, March of 2018, we had some pretty incredibly high, what they call king tides. And this really affected the Cape, not only Boston, which I guess today or yesterday they were getting quite high tides there too. But this particular instance on the Cape, there was, they were getting flooded all along the bay roads and everything like that. But in Eastham, this is at Nauset Light Beach, every year during the early 2000s, the stairway at Nauset Light Beach was getting destroyed every winter. So finally they just had it with rebuilding that, and instead they built a new path that cut down through a low part of the cliff onto the beach at Nauset Light. So this new path had been just cut out not too long before this storm. And I went down there right at high tide to see this. And the water started coming in on this path as I was standing there. And I was getting out of the way quick. And a lot of other people weren't. They were still standing there as the water's rushing in. A couple of people almost got sucked out by the water going back out. And finally, when I saw the water coming in, I backed off. But there was another guy who got one of the greatest photographs I ever saw of a weather event on Cape Cod. There were people who were on that path running from the wave that was coming in, crashing behind them, and they have looks of terror on their faces as they're running. And this same guy told me that after that wave hit, it had knocked one guy down and put him underwater and then the water pulled back out for a minute, and he's soaking wet, and he gets up out of the water and he goes, "God, give me another one." And he's just shaking his head. He couldn't believe it, you know. So that's, you know, just if you're going to do storm watching, be careful. You know, like there's things to remember, like if you're walking along the cliff on Cape Cod, don't go close to the edge because it can give out underneath you. Because not only is it very unstable to begin with, down below the waves are hitting the base of the cliff. That makes it even more unstable. That entire top of the cliff can go out from underneath you. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And of course, there were also all those tornadoes that the Cape had, and especially in 2019 when a water spout came off the water in Hyannis, touched down on land as a tornado in Yarmouth and a couple of places, and then again in Harwich, till it finally died out on the Lower Cape area. And that did a lot of damage, ripped the roof off a hotel in West Yarmouth as well. So that's some of the stuff I cover. Now, looking back on all these storms, this is after the blizzard of '78. This is at Collins Cove, which is right off of the Rotary. It's a colony of cottages that were built there back in the 20s. And they've been there a long time. And this is a little thing they have called the shucking house. They also do shellfish business there. And the shucking house, the families used it, the family used to call it the Fish and Fiddle Club many years ago. But it's been there for a long time. And Ken Collins, who was around during the 70s, he passed away about 15 years ago, I think. He used to mark the level of the storms reached inside there because it would flood that structure, especially after the blizzard of '78. And he would mark the level the storms have reached in the way some people measure the growth of their children, like marking it on the wall. The '78 storm is marked about shin high. The big storm of '87 is waist high. The marks of '91 need no ink. Perfect storm, they cover the garage. So that was the champ out there as far as tidal flooding. So, is the worst yet to come? Sad to say it is. One thing to remember, and this especially applied in 1938, natural calamity strikes at just about the time that one forgets its terror. That's an old Japanese proverb, but it's one thing to remember. Glenn Field at the Weather Service said, a worst case scenario is a storm with the potency of the 1938 hurricane moving over New England again. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when it will happen, he said. In this case, a northern movement of the storm making landfall near Foxwoods in Connecticut would have a 20-foot surge in Narragansett Bay. If you bring the storm up Narragansett Bay, the water has nowhere to go in Buzzards Bay. There would be 30 feet of water at Parkwood Beach in Wareham. 30 feet. And keep in mind, Hurricane Katrina's maximum storm surge was 25 feet. Mildred Champlin said after the perfect storm, she said, we viewed the devastation, and I said I'd never look forward predicting the future. All we know is that Mother Nature is in charge, and we have to be grateful for all the years we've had and enjoy right now. So far, we've been lucky. Another perfect storm will come in the future. We know that. And after Hurricane Bob, the Cape Codder, some editor must have grabbed the reporter and said, hey, call the senior center and see how they made out during the storm. Well, according to the director of the senior center, she said, the seniors didn't have any problems. They all know what to do. It's young people like us who had to figure things out. We think we live in such a sophisticated world, but nature humbles us. That's the conclusion of this talk. I have several more talks coming up in Boston, Orleans, Hyannis, Eastham, Norwell, Foxborough over the coming months. Next summer, I'll be leading more history walks at the National Seashore through the Harwich Conservation Trust. That's at dwcapecod.com/events. I have business cards up here. If you're interested at all, my next book, I'm working on it now, arriving in 2026, Prohibition on Cape Cod, Running in the Rum. So yes, that was big business out on the Cape in those days. And this one, Historic Storms of Cape Cod, on sale here right now. Some of you have already picked up a copy. Feel free to come by after we finish up here. I'll be up here for a little while. Cash or credit is accepted. Thank you for having me. Anybody got any questions? Yeah, Mary.
You know, we had a hurricane here in the mid-1980s, might have been 85.
Gloria.
Gloria, I'm saying it did not hit the Cape at all.
It was, they felt 96-mile-an-hour winds in Falmouth, but as you went further out, they were much less. Gloria, because it tracked up the Connecticut River Valley, it wasn't felt as much on the Cape as it was even here. I was in Easton for that, and we had no power for 5 days. The one thing to remember with a hurricane's landfall, if the hurricane comes ashore, if you're on the east side of that hurricane, that's where the wind is going to be at its worst. If you're on the west side, that's where the rain is going to be at its worst. So if you're to the east of the eye, as we were for Gloria, yeah, the winds were pretty bad. Yeah.
Are they doing anything at the state or the federal level about protecting the seashore? I mean, I grew up in Fairhaven. I know about hurricanes.
Yeah.
But we built that hurricane dike that was built across the Bedford Harbor to save all the fishing boats in the Bedford.
Yeah.
And it's done a remarkable job of protecting the seacoast down there.
You can delay it, but you can't stop it.
No, it's not perfect,
No.
but it's better.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they try to do this everywhere, and yeah, it will help to a certain degree, but one of these days, it's going to break. That's going to be it. You're not going to be able to stop it. The other thing is there's been so much coastal development, and that's the other scary thing. If you get another 1938 hurricane along Buzzards Bay, yeah, there you go. That's the one. If that hits now, with all the development we've had, the damage would be it would be astronomical.
Well, you know, they won't insure the people.
That's right.
And you have to, like, I know at the end of, like, where West Island is, if you go all the way out to Robert's Point, all the houses are on stilts.
Yeah.
Which, of course, would easily go over, you know.
Yeah, and it's, you're always, every time something passes North Carolina, that's what happens. You see that happening. The houses on stilts are going into the Drake. And that's what's going to happen eventually. Coastal development, it's inevitable. Yes?
Just two things. I went to college in New Hampshire and was studying ecology. We went out into the forests to do experiments, and our professor, we noticed a lot of trees that were down. Those were trees that were down during the hurricane of '38.
That's right. Yeah.
And this was in the early 70s, so it had been 35 years, and the devastation was still there. The other thing is, I've spent 60 years, my family on the vineyard, and during one of the 1991 storms, there was a segment of land between Chappaquiddick Island and the other side of Edgartown,
Yes.
where the water opened up and the ocean rushed through into the harbor, and it completely changed the whole area. And my ex-husband drives the Chappaquiddick ferry, and it became extremely difficult for him to navigate because of the rushing water going through that hadn't been there before.
Yeah.
So the devastation that can happen in just a small harbor like that is incredible.
Yeah, all you have to do is knock out one barrier, like with Chatham. You know,
Exactly.
that's another
Same
thing.
Right.
So it will continue to happen. It's going to happen, and
Actually, it's filling in now.
yeah, oh, I'm sure it is. Yes.
And you can't stop that movement.
No,
When I
that's
was-
constant.
When I was a kid, there was a bunker from World War II that was on the sea up on the beach. I mean, hundreds, like 100 yards up on the beach. It's gone.
Yeah.
I mean, the ocean has eaten it.
Yes. Yeah, and that's going to keep happening. That's going to keep happening. Anyone else really quick? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.